The auctioneer's voice was a rhythmic, hypnotic drone, a sound as familiar to the farmers of Blackwood County as the hum of a two-cylinder John Deere. It was late March 1975. The frost was just starting to heave its way out of the ground, leaving the gravel lot a muddy soup that sucked at a man's boots. Steam rose from coffee cups and plumed from the mouths of men in insulated coveralls, their faces weathered by a lifetime of wind and sun. They were here for the estate sale of Old Man Hemlock, a farmer who'd worked his 80 years and died in the same bed he was born in. His machinery was old, but it was paid for, and that meant something. At the back of the line of tractors, past the tired-looking Farmall M and the John Deere 720 with its faded green paint, sat the reason Jacob Miller had driven 30 miles with a cashier's check tucked in his shirt pocket. It was a beast, an abomination to some, a forgotten titan from another era, a versatile D100. It wasn't just a tractor, it was a statement of brute force, 4 massive, equal-sized tires caked in the mud of a dozen forgotten seasons. The articulated steering joint, the very heart of the machine, wept a slow black tear of hydraulic fluid into the gravel below. Its paint, once a proud yellow and red, was now a mottled canvas of rust, sun-bleach and grime. The blocky, unadorned cab looked more like a garden shed bolted onto a frame than a place a man was meant to spend 12 hours. Jake ran a calloused hand over one of the tires. The tread was worn, but the casing was sound. He peered underneath, his eyes tracing the thick steel of the frame, the heavy-duty planetary hubs, the twin drive shafts connecting the axles to the transfer case. It was simple. It was heavy. It was built like a locomotive. The engine was a Cummins V8, a diesel that displaced a monstrous 504 cubic inches. It was an engine built for trucks and generators, not for finesse. A slick, condescending voice cut through his thoughts. "Thinking of getting into the scrap business, Miller?" Jake straightened up slowly. He didn't need to turn to know it was Lyle Peterson. Lyle ran the new John Deere dealership on the edge of town. He smelled of cheap cologne and easy credit. He wore polished boots that had never seen a feedlot and a green dealership jacket that was perpetually clean. "Just lookin', Lyle," Jake said, his voice low and even. Lyle chuckled, a sound like gravel rattling in a can. He gestured expansively at the Versatile. "Look at this thing. An orphan. Company that made it is long gone, bought out. You can't get parts for it. That Cummins is a gutless wonder, all noise and no torque. And look at that cab. You'd roast in the summer and freeze in the winter. It's a relic, Jake. The world's moved on." He leaned in closer, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "I can put you in a brand new 4630. Sound guard body, air conditioning, heat, a radio, power shift transmission, 150 horse at the PTO. We're offering financing right now, prime rate +1. You could be breaking ground next week in comfort, Jake. Farming's about efficiency now, not breaking your back on obsolete junk." Jake looked from Lyle's smug face back to the rusted tractor. He saw what Lyle saw, the rust, the oil leaks, the worn-out seat. But he saw something else too. He saw half-inch steel plate where Lyle's new tractors had sheet metal. He saw gears and shafts he could understand, that he could fix with a wrench and a torch, not a specialized computer. He saw a machine that had been bought with cash and run until it couldn't run anymore, not a piece of equipment that owned its operator through a mountain of banknotes. His own farm, a modest 320 acres his father had left him, was the same. It was small and his equipment was old, a Farmall 560 and a 706, but it was his. Every last fence post, every last bushel of corn in the bin was free and clear. "I like to pay for my equipment when I buy it," Jake said, turning his gaze back to Lyle. Lyle's smile tightened. It was a jab, and he knew it. His entire business model was built on debt. He sold farmers on the idea that they had to have the newest, biggest, and best, and the only way to do that was to sign a note at the bank. A note that Lyle himself often facilitated. He was selling a dream of effortless productivity, but the payments came due whether it rained or not. "That's a poor man's mentality, Jake," Lyle shot back, his voice losing its friendly tone. "You can't expand, can't get ahead, if you're afraid to use the bank's money. The guys who are making real money right now, the guys buying up land, they're leveraged. It's the only way to play the game. The auctioneer was moving down the line. All right, folks, let's move on to this. This big fella here. A versatile D100 four-wheel drive. We don't have a lot of history on it, so you're buying it as is. Where is? It turns over, but we ain't started it. What'll you give, boys? Let's start it at $1,000. Do I hear 1,000? Silence. The crowd looked at the iron behemoth with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. It was too big for most of them and too much of a risk. $1,000 for a four-wheel drive tractor, the auctioneer cajoled. You can't buy the tires for that. Who'll give me 1,000? Lyle Peterson let out a loud theatrical laugh. You'd be better off bidding on the rust. A few of his customers, men who drove shiny new green tractors off Lyle's lot every 2 years, chuckled along with him. Jake felt a slow burn in his gut. He watched the auctioneer, his face impassive. All right, 500 then. $500 to start it. Jake raised a single finger. I got 500 from Mr. Miller. 500 it is. Now who'll give me 6? 600. Silence. The only sound was the wind whistling around the corner of a nearby barn. Lyle shook his head in mock pity. 500 once. 500 twice. The auctioneer scanned the crowd one last time, his eyes pleading, sold for $500 to Jacob Miller. A wave of murmurs went through the crowd. It wasn't the money. $500 was a gamble anyone could afford. It was the principle. It was Jake, the quiet, stubborn farmer who refused to get with the times, buying the one machine that everyone else, especially the self-proclaimed expert Lyle Peterson, had declared worthless. Jake walked toward the clerk's trailer to sign the papers, ignoring the stares and the whispers. He had just bought himself a project, a pariah, a pile of iron that everyone in the county believed would be the anchor that finally dragged him under. Before we go any further into this story, before we see Jake get that beast back to his farm and tear into it, I have to ask you all a question. Have you ever been in Jake's shoes? Have you ever taken a chance on a piece of old, forgotten iron that everybody else called junk? Maybe it was a tractor, a truck, an old engine you found sinking into the dirt behind a barn. Drop a comment below and tell me about it. I want to hear the story of how you brought it back to life and proved all the doubters wrong. All right, let's get back to Jake. He's got a long road ahead of him, and it starts with getting that 10-ton monster home. The first challenge was waking the dead. The Versatile hadn't run in at least 2 years, according to the auctioneer. Jake climbed up the crude ladder-like steps into the cab. The door groaned on rusty hinges. The inside smelled of mouse droppings and decay. The seat was split open, yellow foam guts spilling out. He turned the key. Nothing, not even a click. He spent the next hour with his head under the dash and his hands in the battery box. The batteries were stone dead, their terminals corroded into a fuzzy green mess. He drove his old Ford pickup into town and came back with 2 new heavy-duty truck batteries. After a solid 20 minutes of scraping terminals and wrestling the heavy boxes into place, he connected the cables. Back in the cab, he turned the key. This time, the oil pressure light glowed a dim red, a small victory. He knew better than to just crank it. He climbed atop the massive hood, wrench in hand, and cracked the fuel lines at the injectors, bleeding the air out until a steady stream of clean diesel dripped onto the engine block. He checked the oil. It was low and black as tar, but it was there. The radiator was half full of rusty-looking water. He topped it off from a 5-gallon can he'd brought. Finally, he stood back on the ground, took a deep breath, and climbed into the cab one more time. He pushed the throttle forward a quarter of the way, turned the key, and held it. The starter motor groaned, a deep, painful sound as it struggled to turn over the 8 massive pistons of the Cummins. 1 revolution, 2. It felt agonizingly slow. The engine coughed, sending a puff of white smoke from the fat exhaust stack. He kept the key turned. The starter groaned again, the revolutions coming a little faster now. Another cough, this time followed by a chug. Then another. The whole frame of the tractor shuddered as one cylinder fired, then another. With a final convulsive roar, the V8 caught. It wasn't a smooth idle. It was a rough, loping, angry growl. Black smoke billowed from the stack, thick and oily, carrying with it the smell of unburnt fuel and years of condensation burning off the manifold. The tractor shook and vibrated, the sheet metal of the cab rattling a frantic rhythm. To everyone else who was left in the auction lot, it sounded like a machine tearing itself apart. To Jake, it was the sound of a heartbeat. He let it run for 10 minutes, watching the oil pressure gauge climb to a respectable level and the temperature needle slowly lift off its peg. He worked the clutch, a stiff leg press of a pedal, and managed to find first gear with a painful grind. The trip home was a slow, rattling, bone-jarring crawl. The tractor had no road gear to speak of, topping out at a deafening 12 miles per hour. The articulated steering was sloppy, requiring constant correction to keep the behemoth from wandering into the ditch. Every farmer who saw him pass either shook their head or honked and gave him a thumbs up, though he couldn't tell if the gesture was one of encouragement or mockery. He didn't care. He was focused on the sounds, the smells, the feel of the machine beneath him. He was learning its language. He pulled into his own lane just as the sun was setting, the long shadow of the Versatile stretching out behind him like a prehistoric beast. He parked it next to his machine shed, the big Cummins rumbling next to the quiet hum of his father's old farm-alls. He shut it down, and the sudden silence was jarring. For a long moment, he just sat there in the cab, the heat from the engine ticking as it cooled, his hand still vibrating from the wheel. He had done it. He had brought the orphan home. The real work was just beginning. The next 2 months were a blur of grease, sweat, and frustration. Jake lived in his machine shed. He started by draining every fluid from the tractor. The engine oil came out like sludge. The transmission and differential fluid was a milky grey, contaminated with water. He pulled the drain plug on one of the planetary hubs and was rewarded with a gallon of water before any gear oil appeared. A bad seal. He knew it was just the tip of the iceberg. He split the tractor at the articulation joint using a set of heavy-duty stands and a chain hoist rigged to the main beam of his shed. The center pins and bushings were shot, worn into an oval shape that explained the sloppy steering. A new set from a specialty parts supplier in Fargo would cost over $600. It was more than he'd paid for the whole tractor. He didn't flinch. He made the call and placed the order. While he waited for the parts, he went to work on the axles. He pulled all 4 planetary hubs, the gears so heavy he had to use his engine hoist to lift them onto his workbench. He disassembled them piece by piece, cleaning every gear, bearing and shaft in a tub of solvent until the steel shone. He found 2 cracked bearings and a chipped sun gear. He couldn't just order these parts. They didn't exist anymore, so he spent a day on the phone, calling every salvage yard in 3 states until he found a wrecked Versatile of a similar vintage sitting in a field in western Nebraska. He drove 10 hours straight, paid the man $200, and spent another 6 hours in the mud with a torch and a set of heavy wrenches, cutting the parts he needed from the carcass of the dead machine. Back home, the community's judgment was a constant low-grade hum in the background of his life. When he went to the co-op for bolts, old-timers would pat him on the shoulder. "Heard you're wrestling with that big yellow monster, Jake. Don't let it beat you." It sounded like encouragement, but he heard the pity in their voices. Lyle Peterson was less subtle. He'd hold court at the coffee shop in the mornings. Saw Jake Miller the other day, looked like he'd been rolling in a grease pit. Trying to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear with that old Versatile. "I tell you, a man's time is worth something. By the time he gets that thing field ready, my customers will have their corn planted and cultivated. He's stepping over $1 to pick up a dime." The talk got back to Jake, as it always did in a small town. It stung, but it also hardened his resolve. He let them talk. He kept his head down and his wrenches turning. He rewired the entire tractor, replacing the brittle, cracked insulation with new heavy-gauge wire. He rebuilt the hydraulic cylinders for the steering, honing the insides and replacing every seal. He pulled the injectors from the Cummins and had them tested and rebuilt at a truck shop in the city. He welded patches over the rust holes in the cab floor. By late May, when other farmers were already in the field, the parts from Fargo finally arrived. He spent 3 days meticulously reassembling the articulation joint, packing the new bearings with grease, torquing the bolts to spec. When he finally joined the 2 halves of the tractor back together, it was a milestone. He filled every gearbox with fresh, clean oil. He filled the radiator with a proper mix of antifreeze. The day he finally finished, the sun was high and hot. He climbed into the cab, the seat now patched with a piece of a canvas tarp. He turned the key. The Cummins roared to life, but this time it wasn't a ragged, angry bark. It was a smooth, deep-throated rumble. The black smoke cleared in seconds, leaving just a faint haze in the hot air. He put it in gear, and this time there was no grind. He drove it out of the shed and into the hayfield. The steering was tight and responsive. He could feel the power thrumming through the frame, a sleeping giant now fully awake. He hadn't just fixed a tractor, he had resurrected it. He had poured his own sweat and blood into its iron veins, and now it was a part of him. The world saw a pile of rust. He saw the future of his farm. The years that followed were good ones for American agriculture. The early 1970s saw a massive grain deal with the Soviet Union, and prices for corn and soybeans shot through the roof. A wave of optimism, bordering on euphoria, swept through the heartland. The mantra from the government was clear: get big or get out. Farmers were encouraged to borrow money, buy more land, and plant fence-a-row to fence-a-row. Land that had been $1,000 an acre was suddenly $2,000, then $3,000. And the banks were happy to lend. Lyle Peterson was no longer just a dealer, he was an apostle of the new prosperity. His lot was a gleaming sea of green and yellow. He sold massive 4840 tractors and 7700 combines to farmers who barely paused to look at the price tag. The loan officer from the bank practically had a permanent desk in Lyle's office. Lyle himself was thriving. He bought the 200 acres bordering his dealership, tore down the old farmhouse, and leased the ground to a young, aggressive farmer who had just bought a full line of new equipment from him. All on credit. Lyle traded his pickup for a new Cadillac Eldorado and took to wearing a gold watch that glinted in the sun when he pointed out the features on a new machine. He never missed a chance to take a jab at Jake. He'd see Jake chugging along in the old Versatile, pulling a 24-foot chisel plow, and he'd tell whoever was with him, "See that? That's what holding yourself back looks like." Miller could be farming 1,000 acres right now if he'd just be willing to take a risk. But he's content to play in his little sandbox with his antique toys. And from the outside, Lyle was right. Jake didn't expand. He watched his neighbors get into bidding wars for parcels of land, driving prices to heights that made no sense to him. He watched them tear out windbreaks and drain sloughs to find another few acres to plant. He didn't join them. Instead, he worked his 320 acres with a quiet, relentless efficiency. The Versatile was the heart of his operation. The big Cummins V8, while not as fuel-efficient as the newer engines, had torque that seemed to come from the center of the earth. It never faltered. While his neighbors were waiting for a dealer mechanic to fix a faulty sensor on their new, complex machines, Jake was in the field. He could get his ground worked and planted in a window of good weather that was half as long as what he needed before. He was always done first. This efficiency gave him time he spent not in a banker's office, but in his shop. He bought an old, worn-out John Deere 7700 combine at an auction for pennies on the dollar. It had engine problems, but the rest of the machine was sound. He spent a winter pulling the engine, rebuilding it from the crankshaft up. By the next fall, he had a reliable combine, and he owned it outright. He didn't spend the money from the high grain prices on new luxuries. He lived in the same small farmhouse. He drove the same old Ford pickup. Instead, he saved. He built a new, bigger machine shed with cash. He bought a larger grain bin, allowing him to store his corn and sell it in the spring when prices were typically higher, instead of being forced to sell right out of the field at harvest time. Every decision was deliberate, conservative, and aimed at one thing: eliminating debt and insulating himself from the whims of the market and the bank. His neighbors saw it as a failure of imagination. They saw a man who was afraid. At the coffee shop, the talk was of land payments and operating loans that were bigger than the entire value of Jake's farm. These figures were spoken with a kind of bravado, a testament to their ambition and their faith in the ever-rising market. Jake's name would come up, and they'd shake their heads. Poor Jake, still running that old junk, he's going to get left behind. They didn't see the peace of mind he had. They didn't understand the freedom that came from turning the key in a machine that belonged to him and nobody else. They saw his weathered, rust-stained Versatile as a symbol of his poverty, while he saw it as the very fortress of his independence. One crisp October evening, Jake was in his shop, changing the oil in the Versatile's big Cummins engine. The radio on the shelf was tuned to a station out of Des Moines, the farm report droning on in the background. He was draining the last of the thick black oil when the announcer's tone shifted. He was talking about the Federal Reserve, about a new chairman named Paul Volcker. He used words like inflationary pressures and monetary tightening. He talked about interest rates. The prime rate, the announcer said, had just hit 12%. Jake stopped what he was doing, the greasy wrench still in his hand. 12%. His last operating loan, which he'd paid off in July, had been at 7%. He looked out the open door of his shop. The sun was setting, casting a golden light on the corn stubble in his fields. In the distance, on the highway, he saw the glint of a car. It was Lyle Peterson's Cadillac, heading home from the dealership. Lyle was probably celebrating another record sales month, oblivious to the storm clouds gathering on the economic horizon. Jake wiped his hands on a rag and walked over to the small desk in the corner of his shop. He opened a ledger. His farm was paid for, his tractors, his combine, his planter, all paid for. The new grain bin was paid for. He had a substantial amount of cash in a savings account at the bank. And yet, a cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. He knew that the world of easy credit and ever-rising prices was a party that couldn't last forever. The music was about to stop, and he had a terrible feeling that most of his neighbors wouldn't have a chair to sit on when it did. He looked back at the old Versatile, its rusted hood reflecting the last rays of sunlight. It wasn't just a tractor anymore, it was his ark. And the rain was coming. The first sign of trouble wasn't a headline in the paper or a politician on the television. It was the sky. The spring of 1980 arrived hot and dry. The usual April showers were little more than a dusty spit on the windshield. By May, the ground Jake worked with the old Versatile was hard as fired brick. The big tractor didn't complain, its 4 massive tires clawing at the compacted soil, the Cummins V8 barking its deep-throated song of defiance against the weather. But Jake felt a knot in his gut that had nothing to do with the rough ride. He planted his corn deep, chasing the last bit of moisture, and prayed for rain. The rain didn't come. June baked the fields under a relentless brassy sun. The young corn stalks, which should have been knee-high by the 4th of July, were stunted and pale, their leaves curling inward during the heat of the day, as if in pain. At the coffee shop, the bravado of the past few years had evaporated, replaced by a tense, nervous silence. Men stared into their cups, their faces etched with the same worry Jake saw in his own reflection. Their operating loans were due in the fall, and their collateral was withering in the fields. One sweltering afternoon, Jake was replacing a hydraulic hose on his cultivator when he saw his neighbor, Tom Haskins, walking across the field toward him. Tom was one of Lyle Peterson's star customers. He farmed 1,000 acres with a gleaming fleet of new John Deere equipment, including a brand new 4840 that was the talk of the county. But today Tom looked defeated. His face was streaked with sweat and dirt, his shoulders slumped. "Jake," he said, his voice raspy, "you got a minute?" "Always," Jake replied, wiping his hands on a rag. "It's the 4840, Tom said, kicking at a clod of dry earth. "It just quit, right in the middle of the field. Lights on the dash are blinking, engine won't even try to turn over. I called Lyle's shop. They said the mechanic is tied up for 2 days, and it sounds like the main electronic control unit. Said it'll be $1,500 for the part, plus labor." He let out a bitter laugh. $1,500 for a little black box I'm not even allowed to open, and I'm losing the best cultivating weather we've had in a month. Jake nodded slowly. He'd heard about these problems. The new tractors were powerful and comfortable, but they were filled with complex electronics that were a mystery to the men who operated them. When they broke, you were helpless, completely at the mercy of the dealership. "Want me to take a look?" Jake offered. "Maybe it's just a bad connection." Tom shook his head. "Appreciate it, Jake, but the mechanic warned me. If I so much as touch that wiring harness, it voids the warranty." He looked past Jake, his eyes landing on the Versatile. It sat there, huge and silent, its faded paint absorbing the harsh sunlight. "How do you keep that old thing running?" "Wrenches," Jake said simply, "and a good set of manuals. There isn't a part on it I can't get to or figure out." Tom stared at the old tractor for a long moment, a look of dawning, painful understanding on his face. "You know," he said quietly, "my payment on that 4840 is more than you paid for this whole farm. And right now, yours is worth a hell of a lot more." That was the first crack. The whispers started to change. The talk was no longer about horsepower and acres, but about downtime and repair bills. Lyle Peterson's dealership, once the shining temple of modern agriculture, began to feel different. The lot was still full of new equipment, but it wasn't moving. The salesmen, who used to stride around with confidence, now loitered by the door, their smiles looking forced. Lyle himself grew sharp and defensive. The easy-going charm was replaced by a brittle tension. When farmers came in to complain about the cost of parts or the wait for service, he'd snap at them. "You wanted the best, didn't you? Well, the best costs money to maintain. This isn't the Stone Age anymore." The drought broke in late July with a series of violent thunderstorms that flattened what was left of the corn and washed topsoil into the ditches. The harvest was a disaster. Yields were less than half of what was expected. At the same time, the grain embargo against the Soviet Union, a response to the invasion of Afghanistan, sent crop prices plummeting. It was the perfect storm. Farmers who had borrowed against the promise of $5 corn were now faced with selling it for $2, if they had any to sell at all. Jake's harvest was poor, like everyone else's. But he had a critical advantage. He didn't have to sell. He filled his paid-for grain bin and shut the door. His operating costs for the year had been minimal, mostly fuel and seed. He had no payments to make. He could afford to wait. His neighbors couldn't. The banknotes were coming due. That fall, the first for sale signs began to appear on farm gates, stark and white against the brown, barren fields. They were like tombstones, marking the death of a dream. Lyle Peterson's empire, built on the shifting sands of credit and confidence, was beginning to crumble, and the tremors were shaking the entire county. The winter of 1981 was bleak and cold, but the real chill came from the letters arriving in mailboxes from the Blackwood County Bank. The prime interest rate, which had seemed so shocking at 12% just a couple of years earlier, had climbed to 15%, then 18%, then an unthinkable 21%. Operating loans that were written at 8% were now being renewed at 20%. It was a death sentence. A farmer could do everything right, work hard, manage his crops, and still be crushed by the sheer weight of the interest payments. The farm auctions began in the spring. At first, it was just one or two, the small operators who were on the edge anyway. But soon it became a weekly ritual of sorrow. Families who had worked the same land for 100 years stood silently in their muddy yards, watching as the auctioneer sold off their lives, piece by piece. Jake went to a few, not to buy, but to bear witness. He saw brand-new tractors, combines with barely 100 hours on them, sell for half of what was owed. He saw hardened, proud men break down and weep openly. He saw Lyle Peterson there too, his face pale and drawn, trying to bid on his own dealership's equipment to prop up the prices, only to be outbid by salvage dealers or forced to buy it back himself, sinking deeper into his own hole. Lyle's downfall was as spectacular as his rise. His customers, now bankrupt, defaulted on their loans, and the bank came after Lyle, who had co-signed on many of them. The massive inventory of new equipment on his lot became an anchor, each piece accruing interest on his floor plan loan while its value plummeted. John Deere Corporate, facing its own crisis, offered no relief. They wanted their money. The final inevitable day came in April of 1982. A large sign was posted in front of the dealership. Liquidation auction, Peterson Farm and Implement, by order of the bank. Jake was there. The crowd was huge, a mix of grieving farmers, opportunistic buyers from out of state, and the morbidly curious. The rows of green and yellow machinery, once symbols of boundless prosperity, now looked like a vanquished army waiting to be dismantled. Lyle stood near the auctioneer's truck, a ghost of the man he once was. His expensive jacket was gone, replaced by a simple work coat. The gold watch was missing. He looked thin, lost. He avoided eye contact with everyone, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the horizon. Jake watched as the 4840s and the 7700 combines sold for a fraction of their worth. He didn't bid. He didn't need any of it. His own simple paid-for machines were waiting for him back at the farm. He saw Tom Haskins in the crowd, his farm lost just a month before. Tom caught Jake's eye and gave him a slow, sad nod. It was a nod of concession, of respect. A message passed between them without words. You were right. While the auctioneer was selling off shop tools, Jake slipped away from the main crowd and walked toward the 200 acres of prime bottomland that bordered the dealership, the land Lyle had bought at the peak of the boom. The bank was selling it too, as a separate parcel at the end of the day. Jake walked the fence line, kicking at the rich black soil. He knelt, scooping up a handful. It was good land that deserved to be cared for, not treated as a speculative commodity. He stood up and walked back toward the auctioneer's truck, his decision made. When the land came up for bid, the auctioneer started the bidding at $2,000 an acre. A year ago, it would have been $4,000. Silence. The crowd was broke. Finally, a voice from the back, a land speculator from the city, bid $1,000. The auctioneer tried to work the price up, but the crowd was dead. Jake let the silence hang in the air, then, in a clear, calm voice, he raised his hand. 1,100, he said. The speculator countered at 12. Jake came back at 13. They went back and forth, the bids rising in $100 increments. The crowd turned to watch the duel. It was the old way versus the new, the patient farmer versus the fast-talking investor. When the bid reached $1,700 an acre, the speculator shook his head and dropped out. Sold, the auctioneer cried, his gavel falling with a sharp crack. To Jacob Miller. A quiet murmur went through the crowd, but this time it wasn't one of mockery. It was a murmur of approval. Jake walked to the clerk's trailer, his face impassive. He knew what they were thinking. He knew it looked like the ultimate revenge, buying the very land that had been the symbol of his rival's hubris. But that wasn't it. He wasn't buying a trophy. He was buying a responsibility. He paid for it not with a loan, but with a cashier's check, drawn from the savings he had so carefully, so stubbornly accumulated during the good years. He was planting his harvest in the ashes of his neighbor's folly. After signing the papers, Jake saw Lyle standing alone by his old Cadillac, which was also slated to be sold. The car was dusty, a tire low on air. Lyle looked up as Jake approached, his eyes hollow. He expected a taunt, a final twist of the knife. Lyle, Jake said, his voice even. Come to gloat, Miller? Lyle asked, his voice brittle. Come to tell me you told me so? No, Jake said. He looked at the dealership, at the land he now owned. You were a good salesman. You just started believing your own pitch a little too much. You forgot that the land doesn't care about interest rates. It just cares about the rain. He paused, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a set of keys. I'm going to need help getting the corn in on that new piece of ground. The pay's not great, but it's honest work. Starts Monday if you want it. Lyle stared at the keys, then at Jake, his face a mask of confusion and disbelief. For the first time, the arrogant shell cracked completely, and he looked like a man drowning. He didn't take the keys. He just nodded, unable to speak, and turned away. Jake left the keys on the hood of the Cadillac and walked back to his old Ford pickup. He hadn't just survived the storm, he had endured it with his principles and his humanity intact. The years that followed were a slow healing. The farm crisis left deep scars on Blackwood County. Main Street was dotted with shuttered businesses. Many families moved away, never to return. But for those who remained, the community was smaller, quieter, and stronger. The talk at the coffee shop was different now. Men talked about fixing their own machinery, about helping a neighbor finish his planting, about the price of seed, not the price of land. They talked about weather and family. The bravado was gone, replaced by a hard-won wisdom. Jake Miller became an unlikely patriarch. Farmers would stop by his shop, not just for a cup of coffee, but for advice. Jake, my 4020 is losing hydraulic pressure. What do you think? Jake, I've got a chance to rent another 80. You think I should risk it? He never preached. He'd just listen, then walk them over to the Versatile, which sat in the shed like a sleeping king. He'd point to a simple gear or a heavy steel plate. Keep it simple, he'd say. Own what you run. Don't let the iron own you. The rest will take care of itself. He farmed his original 320 acres and the new 200 with a quiet rhythm. He never got bigger. He didn't need to. The farm was profitable, secure. He saw Lyle Peterson from time to time. Lyle never took the job, but he stayed in town, working as a mechanic at the local garage. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet competence. They would nod when they saw each other at the post office, a silent acknowledgement of the history that lay between them. There was no animosity left, only the shared memory of a storm they had both weathered in very different ways. Jake's son, Michael, grew up in the shadow of the old Versatile. He was a boy during the crisis, but he remembered the hushed, worried conversations, the sight of his father's greasy hands at the dinner table. As a teenager, he learned to drive on the Farmall 560, but the tractor that fascinated him was the big yellow one. It wasn't just a machine, it was a legend, the hero of the family story. One evening in the late 1980s, Jake and a 17-year-old Michael were in the shop, working together to replace the clutch on the old beast. It was a massive, greasy job. They had the tractor split in two, the big Cummins engine resting on a stand. "You know, Dad," Michael said, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of a greasy hand. "I was talking to some of the guys at school. Their dads are all buying new tractors again. Big red ones, blue ones. They say this old thing is an antique." Jake stopped turning his wrench and looked at his son. He saw the question in the boy's eyes. The lure of the new, the shiny, the easy. It never went away. "Let me tell you something about this antique," Jake said, his voice low and serious. He tapped the thick transmission housing with his wrench. "This piece of iron right here is the reason you have a college fund. It's the reason we never missed a meal when our neighbors were losing their homes. It's the reason this farm will be here for you, if you want it." He looked around the shop, at the lathes and the welders and the shelves full of tools and spare parts. "This isn't just a tractor, Mike. It's a philosophy. It's about knowing the difference between what you want and what you need. It's about understanding that real wealth isn't about the size of your debt, but the freedom from it. These other guys, they're just starting the cycle all over again, forgetting the lessons that are written on every gravestone in that little cemetery down the road." He picked up his wrench again. "Now grab that alignment tool. We've got to get this thing back together. The ground's not going to plow itself." Years later, Jake was an old man, his hands gnarled with arthritis, but his mind still sharp. Michael ran the farm now, using a mix of modern, practical equipment and the old, reliable iron. But every spring, on the first day of fieldwork, a tradition was honored. Michael would climb into the cab of the versatile D100. The seat was freshly reupholstered, the glass was clean, but the paint was still a patchwork of faded yellow, red, and honorable rust. He'd turn the key, and the big Cummins V8 would roar to life, the sound a deep, familiar rumble that echoed across the fields. Jake would stand by the door of the machine shed, leaning on a cane, and watch as his son drove the old tractor out into the morning light. He'd watch it hook up to the chisel plow and head for the field, its four big wheels turning, churning the rich black soil that it had saved. He saw more than a tractor. He saw a legacy. He saw the stubborn, quiet heart of his family, cast in iron and steel, rumbling on into the future, a testament to the simple, enduring truth that sometimes the surest way forward is to hold on to the things the world has forgotten.